Close your eyes and picture a saber-toothed predator. Odds are you just built the animal everyone builds. A muscular cat in tall Ice Age grass, two curved daggers hanging past its jaw, stalking mammoths across a frozen plain. That animal was real. Its name was Smilodon, and it hunted the Americas until roughly 10,000 years ago, but it was nowhere near the first. The predator that carried those blades before anything else on land arrived tens of millions of years before the earliest dinosaur, and it did not belong to the reptiles. It belonged to us. To meet it, you have to travel back 250 million years to a world with no grass, no birds, no flowers, and no cats of any kind. The time is the late Permian, and the map of the planet looks wrong. Every landmass has fused into one enormous slab of rock and desert, the supercontinent Pangaea, so wide that a storm could roll across its interior for weeks and never once reach the sea. There are forests of strange seed ferns and squat, sprawling cousins of conifers. There are lumbering plant-eaters shaped like beaked barrels, and armored things the size of small cars grazing the floodplains. And moving through all of it, sitting at the summit of the food chain, is a group of animals called gorgonopsians, named fittingly after the Gorgons of Greek myth, the monsters whose stare turned the living to stone. Take a moment to feel the weight of that world. The late Permian was hot and often brutally dry, a greenhouse planet with sprawling deserts at its heart, and no polar ice to speak of. There were no grasses to soften the ground and no flowers anywhere, since both were still many millions of years from evolving. Insects droned through humid lowland forests, early relatives of dragonflies and beetles, and the rivers ran thick with fish and amphibians. On land, the plant-eaters had only recently grown large enough to feed big predators above them, and that fresh abundance of meat is precisely what the gorgonopsians rose to exploit. They were, in a real sense, the first large, specialized land hunters our branch of life ever produced. Here is the fact that rearranges your mental furniture. Gorgonopsians were not reptiles. For most of the 20th century, textbooks filed them under a comfortable, wrong little phrase, mammal-like reptiles, as if they were lizards doing a clumsy impression of something warmer. They were nothing of the sort. They were synapsids, and more specifically therapsids, which is the great branch of the tree of life that leads, eventually, to mammals, to mice and whales, to the dog asleep on your couch, to you, sitting there watching this. A gorgonopsian is not a distant cousin of the dinosaurs. It is a cousin of yours, and a far closer one. The paleontologist who first sliced gorgonopsian teeth into thin sections and studied them under a microscope put it about as bluntly as a scientist ever will, pointing out that these animals are more closely related to human beings than they are to any dinosaur. Let that reframe the whole picture. The original saber-tooth belonged to our own extended family, and it was already ruling the land long before the first dinosaur, long before the first true mammal, and some 200 million years before that Ice Age cat you conjured a moment ago. You can even see the family resemblance in the bones, if you know where to look. Down each side of a gorgonopsian skull sits a single opening behind the eye socket, a window in the bone where the jaw muscles anchored. That opening is the defining mark of a synapsid, and you are carrying your own version of it in your temples. Look closer, and the story gets stronger. Buried in the therapsid jaw are little bones that over 100 million years and countless generations would migrate and shrink and reinvent themselves into the tiny bones inside your middle ear, the ones vibrating as you listen to this sentence. So when someone tells you a saber-tooth is just a fancy reptile, they have it exactly backwards. The saber-tooth itself, that iconic curved blade, is a great deal older than any of the famous creatures we tend to hang it on. Those teeth came first. The cats showed up ludicrously late to a party their own distant relatives had already thrown. That timeline is worth pinning down, because the gap is even wider than it sounds. The first dinosaurs would not appear until somewhere around 230 million years ago, well into the period that came after. The first true mammals arrived later still, roughly 200 million years back. Smilodon, the cat in your mind's eye, is a creature of the last ice age, practically yesterday by these standards. Inostrancevia and its kin were already the reigning killers of the land, while every one of those familiar animals was still tens or even hundreds of millions of years away from existing. The gorgonopsians did not merely predate the saber-toothed cat, they predated the entire age of dinosaurs, top to bottom, with room to spare. Now let me introduce the star of this particular story, because gorgonopsians came in a wide spread of sizes, from things no bigger than a house dog, to the animal that anchors everything you are about to hear. Its name is Inostrancevia, and it is the largest gorgonopsian anyone has ever pulled out of the ground. It was first described back in 1922 by the Russian paleontologist Vladimir Amalitsky from skeletons weathering out of the banks of the northern Dvina River in Russia, and for close to a century it stood as a purely Russian monster. Picture something between a tiger and a bear in raw bulk. The body ran roughly 3 to 3.5 meters from snout to tail. Call it 11 feet, or a little more. The skull alone stretched to around 50 centimeters. A heavy, narrow wedge of bone built around one uncompromising purpose. And the canines, the reason we are all here, grew up to about 15 centimeters, roughly half a foot of serrated, ivory-colored blade, curving down out of the upper jaw. This was the earliest apex predator ever to carry that grade of weaponry anywhere on land. The name itself carries a little history, honoring a 19th century Russian geologist, and the first skeletons were quarried from frozen riverbanks in the far north of European Russia, from beds so dense with bone that they have been called a Permian graveyard. Hold on to the image of that bear-sized hunter with its half-meter skull, because everything that follows hangs on the skull and the twin blades it carried. What did it actually look like in the flesh? Here, I have to be honest with you, because the honest answer is more interesting than a confident one. From a distance, Inostrancevia would have read as vaguely reptilian, low-slung and broad-skulled, more crocodile-adjacent than feline. The skin was probably thick and leathery, the sort of hide you find on an elephant or a rhinoceros today, built to shrug off the scrapes and kicks of wrestling, large, panicking animals. But did it have hair, a set of whiskers, a dusting of fuzz across the back? The fossils, frustratingly, refuse to say, and so the truthful answer is that nobody knows. Anyone who draws Inostrancevia bald is making a guess, and anyone who draws it fuzzy is making one too, and so, now, are you. That uncertainty is not a hole in the story. In a real sense, it is the story, because this animal sits right in the blurry borderland where reptile-like ancestors were slowly, across millions of years, assembling the toolkit that would one day make a mammal. It is a snapshot of a family in the middle of becoming itself. Inostrancevia sits at the extreme end of a trend you can watch unfold in the fossil record. The early gorgonopsians of the middle Permian were modest creatures, some with skulls only 10 to 15 centimeters long, about the size of a dog's head. Over the millions of years that followed, the group swelled, skull by skull, generation by generation, until it produced heads pushing 60 centimeters and bodies with the mass of a bear. This is the same slow arms race that plays out among predators everywhere, prey growing bigger and better armored, hunters growing bigger and better armed to keep up. Inostrancevia was where that Permian arms race topped out, the largest, heaviest expression of a very old design. It did not rule alone either. The late Permian has given up a whole caste of these animals living alongside the plodding herbivores they hunted, a snapshot of a working ecosystem with gorgonopsians of several sizes slotted in at different rungs of the ladder. The smaller ones would have taken smaller prey, the way a lynx and a lion carve up a modern landscape between them. Inostrancevia sat at the very top, the tiger of its world, built to take on the big, dangerous, well-armored game that nothing else could safely touch. That is a specific and demanding place to make a living, and it is exactly the place that, as we will see, turns out to be the most fragile of all when a world begins to come apart. But let's talk about the weapon, because the weapon is where Inostrancevia stops being a curiosity and becomes something truly frightening. And the mechanics here are the part that almost nobody bothers to tell you. Look closely at one of those long canines and you will notice it is not a smooth spike. The cutting edge is serrated, lined with tiny sawtooth ridges running the length of the blade, the exact same principle that puts an edge on a steak knife. Paleontologists have a word for this kind of tooth, zitvedont, and for a long stretch of time they treated it as a signature of the meat-eating dinosaurs, the theropods, the lineage that eventually produced Tyrannosaurus. Then, in 2020, a research team led by a Harvard scientist named Megan Whitney slid gorgonopsian teeth under a microscope and examined how those serrations were built layer by layer out of enamel and dentine. What they published in the journal Biology Letters was startling. The serrations were not merely similar to arthropods in a loose squint-in-the-match way. Down at the level of tissue, in the folded internal architecture that shaped each little tooth along the blade, some gorgonopsians had converged on nearly the same engineering solution the carnivorous dinosaurs would land on, whole ages before those dinosaurs even existed. Two completely separate branches of life, our branch and the reptile branch, independently invented the serrated steak knife. One detail in particular got the researchers' attention. The internal structure of those gorgonopsian serrations looked more like a dinosaur's than like the serrations of other saber-toothed animals on the mammal line, the gorgonopsian and the theropod. Distant strangers separated by an unimaginable gulf of time had arrived at the same blueprint, because when your problem is slicing cleanly through flesh, physics only offers a handful of good answers, and life keeps stumbling onto the same ones. There is even a mechanical reason the fine details mattered. The small pockets of tissue folded in between the serrations appear to have helped spread out the stresses that tore through a tooth every time it bit down on something large and thrashing. So the design was not only sharp, it was tough, built to keep from shattering under the strain of a real kill, which is no small thing when the animal on the other end of the tooth outweighs a car. Those serrations also point straight at how the animal fed. Meat-eating dinosaurs are often described as puncture and pull hunters, sinking the teeth in and hauling backwards so the serrations do the cutting on the draw. The tissue structure of these gorgonopsian teeth hints that some of them worked their prey the very same way. Now, stack another feature on top of that. Inostrancevia could open its jaws to an almost cartoonish gape, possibly past 90 degrees, a full right angle of yawning mouth, and it could do this without dislocating or unhinging the jaw the way a snake swallows an egg. Try opening your own mouth to a right angle, and you will quickly appreciate the engineering involved. All of that gape existed for one reason: to swing those enormous canines clear and drive them home. Behind the sabers, though, the mouth turned strangely bare. The teeth we lean on hardest, the grinding molars at the back, were reduced in gorgonopsians, and in some species they were gone altogether. This was not an animal designed to chew a careful meal. It was designed to open a catastrophic wound and let the wound finish the argument. Even the incisors at the front carried tiny serrations, so the business end of this creature, from the nipping teeth to the great curved daggers, was essentially a rack of blades. That whole arrangement marks this out as a specialist rather than a generalist. A jaw full of grinding teeth is the sign of an animal that carefully processes its food, that chews and mashes and squeezes the most out of a carcass. Inostrancevia had traded most of that machinery away in favor of a front-loaded killing kit, the serrated incisors and the great curved sabers. Everything about it was built to bring down large animals and open them up, and comparatively little else. Specialists like that are devastatingly effective, as long as their particular prey stays abundant. They are also, by the very same logic, hostages to that prey, and to the stable world that keeps it fed. Hold that thought, because it comes back with a vengeance before we are through. So how do you kill a heavily built plant eater with a mouth like that? The leading idea is a tactic that sounds almost unsettlingly patient. Inostrantsevia's world was stocked with big, well-defended prey, barrel-bodied herbivores called dicynodonts, with sharp horned beaks, and pariasaurs, hulking armored reptiles with pebbly, bony skin, some of them approaching the size of a small car. You do not just bowl those over and pin them. Instead, the gorgonopsian most likely used a bite-and-retreat approach. It would close the distance, deliver one committed, slashing bite, sabers in, haul back, opening a single devastating gash. Then it would let go. Then it would follow. It tracked the injured animal from a safe distance for as long as the job required, while blood loss and shock did the slow work its jaws had begun, and when the prey finally staggered and went down, it moved in to finish things. This is an efficient way to kill. It is also, if you happen to be the animal being trailed across a Permian floodplain for the better part of a day, an extraordinarily grim one. Here is a detail I love, and it neatly solves a problem you may not have realized the animal had. If your entire hunting strategy rests on two long, thin, curved teeth, what happens the day one of them snaps? Because eventually it will snap. Drive 6 inches of serrated ivory into a struggling, armored animal enough times and sooner or later a saber cracks, and a saber-toothed predator with a broken saber is just a very large creature having the worst afternoon of its life. Gorgonopsians carried an answer to that, and it is beautifully simple. They replaced their teeth continuously throughout life, a condition biologists call polyphyodonty, the same endless dental conveyor belt you see in a shark or a crocodile. But the clever part is the timing. The left and right canines were held deliberately out of step with each other. While the saber on one side stood fully grown and battle-ready, its counterpart on the other side was still erupting, still climbing into position behind the gum. So the animal was almost never caught weaponless. Break one, and a fresh one was already most of the way in, waiting its turn. It amounted to a living insurance policy, grown right into the skull. Back in 1984, 2 British paleontologists, Doris and Kenneth Kermack, studied these teeth and proposed something even more evocative. They suggested that the canines kept growing to match the growing skull, snapping off and regrowing again and again until the animal reached full adult size and the growth at last stopped. If they were right, then you are looking at an early, rough draft of something your own mouth does. Because mammals, ourselves included, eventually gave up that endless conveyor belt of teeth in favor of a strict, finite set. You get 1 round of baby teeth, then 1 round of adult teeth, and after that, biology hands you the bill and closes the account. Somewhere back among the theropsids, in animals very much like this one, that great transition from unlimited teeth to a countable few was only just beginning. The gorgonopsian was carrying an early hint of the deal every mammal alive has since inherited. Step back, and that is the quiet marvel of this animal. Everything about Inostrancevia seems to point 2 directions at once. The leathery, reptile-like exterior looks backward, toward the ancient ancestors it descended from. The finer details, the specialized teeth, the jaw muscles anchored through that window in the skull, the little bones drifting slowly toward an inner ear, all point forward, toward the mammals that had not arrived yet. You are looking at evolution caught in mid-sentence, a predator suspended between the ancestors it came from and the warm-blooded descendants its line would someday produce. And it wore that unfinished body while ruling the largest landmass the planet has ever assembled, which makes what came for it all the more sobering. If a 250-billion-year-old predator is reshaping how you think about deep time, do me a small favor and hit subscribe. This channel goes hunting for the rarely told version of the prehistoric world, the stories tucked underneath the stories you already know, and I would love to have you along for the ride. Now, back to the sabers, because the strangest thing about them is not how old they are. It is how many separate times life reinvented them. Here is the twist that turns this from a story about one animal into a story about evolution itself. That saber-tooth design, the elongated, blade-like upper canine, is not some one-off freak of nature. It is one of life's favorite ideas, a shape it has reached for over and over in completely unrelated animals across 250 million years of deep time. Paleontologists have counted the saber-tooth body plan evolving independently at least 5 separate times along the mammal side of the tree, and some counts run higher still. Toss in oddities like macaroids, an Eocene meat-eater from an extinct branch called the creodonts that grew its own pair of stabbing canines, and the tally climbs further. The gorgonopsians got there first, deep in the Permian. Then, across colossal stretches of time, the same idea kept resurfacing. It reappeared in the nimrivids, cat-like predators sometimes nicknamed false saber-tooths, close to cats but not quite the real thing. The pattern surfaced yet again in the barbarophilids, which pushed the design towards some of its most exaggerated, oversized proportions. It even cropped up in a pouched relative of the marsupials, a South American hunter called Thylacosmilus, which grew sabers so long that it evolved bony guards along its lower jaw just to shelter them. And of course, the same blueprint arrived one final time in the true cats, the Machairodonts, the family that gave us your friend Smilodon. 5 separate lineages. 5 separate times. Life said, wide-eyed and starting from scratch. What this situation calls for is an enormous stabbing tooth. In 2025, researchers modeling the shapes of these teeth argued that the saber form keeps returning because it sits at a kind of engineering sweet spot, a functional optimum for one particular style of killing. Evolution, running the same experiment on different animals in different eras, kept arriving at the same result. The way rainwater poured across a hillside keeps finding its way into the same valley. Something binds all of these hunters together, beyond the teeth themselves. A modern lion or tiger, armed with shorter, cone-shaped canines, tends to kill with a suffocating clamp, seizing the throat or the muzzle and holding on until the prey stops breathing. The saber-toothed hunters played a different game. Long, flattened, blade-edged canines are superb for slicing a deep wound in one decisive strike, and comparatively brittle for gripping and grappling a struggling animal. Every lineage that grew them, from the Permian gorgonopsian to the Ice Age cat, seems to have leaned toward that same approach, the deep cut over the long hold. The tool kept shaping the strategy over and over in animals that never met and never could have. And here is the little dagger of irony to close that thought. Smilodon, the animal you pictured at the very start, the one that gets the museum posters and the movie cameos, carried comparatively delicate serrations that tended to wear down fairly fast. The gorgonopsians serrations, the 250 million-year-old original, were in some ways the sturdier, more theropod-like design. The famous saber-toothed cat turned up 200 million years behind schedule to a blueprint its distant relatives had already field-tested. And not a single one of those 5 saber-toothed lineages, not the cats, not the marsupial relative, not the gorgonopsians, is still with us. Every last branch of this idea has been pruned off the tree. Which brings us at last to how the very first one ended, and that is where the story turns properly unsettling. For nearly 100 years, Inostrancevia was strictly a Russian animal. Every good specimen came up out of the ground in European Russia, and paleontologists reasonably assumed that is where it lived and died, a giant of the northern part of Pangaea and nowhere else. Then, in 2023, that tidy picture blew apart. A team led by Christian Camera and Pia Viglietti published a study in the journal Current Biology describing Inostrancevia fossils that had come not from Russia, but from the Karoo Basin of South Africa, most of a world away. There is a wonderful, very human wrinkle in this whole affair. Those South African bones had been sitting unremarked in museum collections for more than a decade before anyone realized what they were. The discovery did not happen out in some sun-baked field with a pick and brush. It happened at a collection drawer, when a sharp-eyed scientist finally looked closely and recognized a familiar face from 7,000 miles away. Because that is the real distance we are talking about. Between the Russian sites and the South African ones, the genus Inostrancevia spans something on the order of 11,300 kilometers, roughly 7,000 miles, across the single vast continent of Pangaea. And I want to be careful and honest about what that does and does not mean, because this is exactly the sort of fact that gets spun into a bad legend. That figure is a range across an entire genus, mapped over an enormous slice of deep time. It is not the tale of one heroic beast marching 7,000 miles on a lonely doomed quest. Nobody has ever tracked a single Inostrancevia hiking across the supercontinent, and nobody ever will. What the fossils honestly tell us is that this kind of predator, this whole lineage, managed to occupy a staggering sweep of the ancient world. How it spread that far, and how quickly it managed the trip, we do not know. The map is real and astonishing. The lone wolf odyssey is a fairy tale, and I'm not going to sell it to you. What those South African fossils did reveal, though, is far more haunting than any single migration could ever be, and it is the reason this entire story matters. When the researchers lined up the timing, working out who was living and dying in the Karoo and exactly when, they found a pattern that reads like a red light blinking on a dashboard. The local apex predators in that region, a different group of gorgonopsians called rubigenes, had gone extinct noticeably before the main extinction event even arrived. The top of the food web emptied out early, ahead of schedule, And into that sudden vacancy, that abruptly ownerless throne, stepped Inostrancevia, arriving from far away to briefly become the new dominant hunter of southern Pangaea. It moved into the vacant apex role. In fairly short order, it too was gone. The scientists behind the discovery reached for a phrase that lodges itself in your head. They called these top predators canaries in the coal mine. Miners used to carry canaries down into the tunnels because the little birds, being far more sensitive, would sicken and die from bad air long before the men felt a thing, buying everyone a few precious minutes of warning. The great predators of the late Permian did something eerily similar. Apex hunters depend on enormous, stable ecosystems humming along beneath them, vast populations of prey, functioning food webs, an entire pyramid of life holding them aloft. When that pyramid begins to wobble, the animal at the very peak is the first to topple, because it has the least margin for error and the most weight resting on everything below. The rapid turnover of top predators in the Karoo, one apex hunter dying out, another rushing in to take its place and dying out as well, was the ecological equivalent of the canary going silent in its cage. Something enormous was coming. That something has a name. Paleontologists call it the end Permian mass extinction, though it has earned a far grimmer nickname, the Great Dying. It struck around 252 million years ago, and it remains, by a wide and terrible margin, the worst catastrophe living things have ever faced on this planet. The best estimates suggest it wiped out up to 96% of all marine species and something like 70% of land-dwelling vertebrate species. Not individuals, species, whole branches of the living world switched off permanently in what amounts to a geological blink. Life would need millions upon millions of years afterward just to rebuild anything resembling a rich ecosystem. The trigger was not a rock falling from the sky. It was the Earth turning on itself. In what is now Siberia, an almost incomprehensible volume of volcanic activity, a region known today as the Siberian Traps, split the crust open and poured out lava across an area the size of a continent, and it kept doing so for a very long time. Those eruptions belched carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, spiking global temperatures, souring the oceans with acid, and draining the seas of the oxygen that life depends on. The planet baked and suffocated at the same time, and the gorgonopsians, the whole magnificent saber-toothed lot of them, Inostrancevia squarely among them, did not make it through. Every branch of the group ended right here, at this wall. Their long reign as the first apex predators of the mammal line closed inside the largest die-off in the history of the world. A handful of hardier theropsids, small survivors like the stubborn, pig-shaped Dicynodont Lystrosaurus, would crawl out the far side and carry the mammal lineage forward toward, eventually, us. But the saber-tooths of the Permian were finished. It is hard to overstate how deep this wound went. The recovery did not take thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands. Ecosystems stayed impoverished and unstable for something like 5 million years afterward, an eternity of a bruised world groping its way back toward richness. And when fuller food webs finally did reassemble, in the Triassic period that followed, the cast had changed. The theropsids were battered survivors now, no longer the undisputed lords of the land, and a different group of animals was steadily climbing toward the top spots. Those were the archosaurs, the lineage that would branch into crocodiles and, before very long, the first dinosaurs. The Great Dying did not just end the gorgonopsians. It cleared the stage for the age that replaced them. Yet the story of the gorgonopsians is somehow still not over, because we keep on finding them, and the newest discoveries keep shoving the edges of the map outward. In 2024, on the Mediterranean island of Mallorca, paleontologists described the oldest gorgonopsian ever unearthed, a smaller, roughly dog-sized animal from rock dated to somewhere between 270 and 280 million years old. That find pushed the origin of the entire lineage further back in time, and it placed those origins in what was then the hot equatorial heart of Pangaea, hinting that this whole branch of our family may have gotten its start in the ancient tropics rather than the temperate south, in exactly the kind of place fossil hunters had not been looking. Then, in 2025, Inostrancevia itself surfaced once more, this time confirmed in Mozambique, stretching its known African range wider still. The map of this animal is being redrawn in our own time, by people patiently brushing dust off bone. Now, before we close the book, I want to do the thing that separates a real look at prehistory from a comfortable fairy tale, which is to tell you plainly where the honest edge of our knowledge really sits. Because a great deal of what you will read about Inostrancevia is stated with a confidence the fossils do not earn. Was it warm-blooded, running hot like a mammal, or cold-blooded, or something in between the two? We are not sure. Did it hunt in the glare of day, or under cover of night? Unknown. Did it wear hair, as we wondered earlier, or none at all? Still unknown. And how did it bring the next generation into the world? You will find confident claims out there that gorgonopsians laid eggs, and you will find equally confident illustrations of them curled around a clutch. But the plain truth is that for Inostrancevia in particular, there is no solid fossil evidence that it laid eggs or that it gave live birth. On that question we are guessing, filling a silence with a picture. Even the most obvious question of all, why grow such extreme teeth in the first place, has no settled answer. Back in 2002, the researchers Blair Van Valkenburg and Ian Jenkins raised the possibility that the sabers were partly about display, about attracting mates or facing down rivals, rather than purely about killing. It is a reasonable idea, but with an animal buried this deep in time, it is also very likely untestable. There is no monster lurking in these gaps, no lost folklore, no secret waiting to be cracked. There is only an old, honest phrase that good scientists are brave enough to say out loud. We don't know. What we do know, though, is more than enough to leave a mark on you. The first predator ever to carry a saber-tooth was not a cat, and it was not a dinosaur. It was a distant, thick-hided, blade-mouthed relative of yours hunting across a vanished supercontinent 260 million years ago. Its sudden arrival and its swift disappearance marked the leading edge of the largest extinction the world has ever known. The predators went first. Whenever the animals at the very peak of the food web start blinking out, and new ones rush in only to blink out in turn, it has meant the same thing in every age, in the Permian and in every century since, that the ground beneath the whole system is beginning to give way. That was not a warning Inostrancevia was ever around to hear. It is one that we are, and it is worth carrying with you the next time you stand in front of a saber-tooth behind museum glass and remember just how many times, and just how completely, that beautiful design has already risen and vanished from the earth. If you stayed with me all the way to here, thank you for spending this stretch of time in deep time. Stick around the channel, and I will keep digging up the stranger, truer corners of the prehistoric world, one lost animal at a time.